Donald Trump is heading back to the White House.
Together we can truly make America great again.
We are in for an unpredictable but fascinating 4 years.
And we're going to be following every twist and turn for the first 100 days. We'll be bringing you the latest updates and analysis first thing every morning. So join me, James Matthews.
Me, Martha Kellner.
And me, Mark Stone.
For Trump 100, every weekday at 6 a.m, wherever you get your podcasts.
Good morning and welcome to Politics with Sam and Anne, the podcast that gives you everything you need to know about the day ahead in British politics in under 20 minutes, we promise. And a very, very happy birthday to Rachel Reeves. And I have to say, it might be because in the last few minutes, the Office for National Statistics has given her a bit of a birthday present.
Oh, you're teasing us there a bit, Sam. And actually, it is a double cabinet birthday. Defence Secretary John Healey's birthday today as well. And like Rachel, he's got a lot on his plate with Trump and Ukraine. More from us on that in a bit. It is Thursday, February the 13th. My name is Anne McElvoy of Politico. With me, Sam Coates from Sky News. And Sam, we got an extra half hour to read the news because we delayed the recording of the podcast by about half an hour to start with the breaking economic news of the day, quarterly GDP stats for the last 3 months of 2025. And how did that go for us all?
Yep, no messing around here. In the last few minutes, the Office for National Statistics numbers have dropped, and it is by the smallest of margins good news for Rachel Reeves. GDP from October to December last year grew, and it grew by 0.1%, which is the smallest amount that could be called growth. But growth it is, and this government needs growth politically as well as economically. If you remember from July to September, it was 0.0% growth after a revision. And there, at the worst end of the scenario, the Treasury could have seen the third quarter of 2024's growth being downgraded and the fourth quarter being a contraction and therefore Britain entering recession. That absolutely hasn't happened. Instead, we've got growth in the last quarter and no such revision to the third quarter. So they'll be happy about that. Happy politically. Economically, I'm not sure really there has been any change at all, any meaningful change here. But I'm quite sure that inside the Treasury, they'll particularly be pointing to, because you get monthly breakdowns as well as quarterly breakdowns. And people had thought that the figure in December was going to be particularly grim because of some of those surveys that came out. But in December, just for that month, the economy rose 0.4%. So that sort of implies that there is an upward trend, although, again, we're dealing with very, very small percentage points. Straight out of the blocks, Chancellor Rachel Reeves has just issued a statement effectively blaming what is stagnant growth on her predecessor. She says, for too long, politicians have accepted an economy that has failed working people. I won't. After 14 years of flatlining living standards, we are going further and faster through our plan for change to put more money in people's pockets. That's why we're taking on the blockers. And she lists some of the things that they're doing to promote growth. It isn't a perfect picture, however, for the Labour Party and for Rachel Reeves, because in this figure you get a lot of data from the ONS at moments like this, and alongside the overall national GDP, they've calculated what they call GDP per head. So sort of, it's an approximation of the wealth of individuals. And in the fourth quarter of last year, that actually fell. That fell by 0.1%. And I think that's for the second quarter in a row. And of course, that's now what the Tories have seized upon. Andrew Griffiths, the Shadow Business Secretary, has just said today's confirmation of an official GDP per head recession shows that in just 6 months, Labour have crushed confidence and driven the UK economy into a ditch. To get the UK back on the road, business now's urgent action, and it calls on them to drop the Employment Rights Bill. So I think that's there'll be a little bit today of it depends which set of statistics that you look at, but I think everybody would prioritise the sort of main number, that overall growth. And just before I ask you for your reaction, one little thing that I've picked up, it's fascinating on the Tory side, just a little bit of competitiveness there. Andrew Griffiths' reaction, he's the shadow business secretary. He actually managed to get his response to me before anything from the shadow Chancellor Mel Stride. Andrew, always very, very on it. I wonder whether the shadow Chancellor's office are quite so impressed that we're reading his the shadow business secretary's response before Andrew's. But that'll be put down to tittle tattle by Kemi Badenoch, no doubt.
Oh, well, he has to get into his stride, doesn't he? And I think he has to also, he will be figuring out exactly what they want the bigger message to be, I would say, in fairness. But I think you're right, there's a degree of competitiveness. Of course, Andrew Griffiths was probably another contender for that job. And as you suggest, Sam, this takes away the headache. You could take away the headache pills from Rachel Reeves to an extent. Obviously, this is very recently sort of breaking stats. I had a quick look at the government's own account where this is coming from. And it does seem to be service sector. It's mainly service sector uptick at the very end of last year. Well, that's got to be good, and it's got to reflect some confidence in the economy. But it does leave that bigger picture, doesn't it? Which is great to have British services looking that they're perking up. But where does this leave like the big things that she's been focusing on that's really going to drive growth, which is manufacturing, the kind of world that she wants to live in which we can pivot how competitive we are in the wider world. Now, if you're Rachel Reeves, you say, oh, come on, you didn't really expect that to happen in such short order. But the fact that it is a smidge going upwards is, of course, the right direction for where she is. She can shape a narrative around that. But now, of course, what needs to happen is it needs to power forwards, and that will be, it's an open question whether that happens. I thought it was quite interesting for the Conservatives. You pointed out there they were keen to get in there early with that response. Crushing confidence, driving the economy into a ditch. Well, the stats don't really bear that out. that looks like a script. I don't know what you thought. It looked to me like, when you write a script for something, which can happen in podcasting, which then doesn't actually quite happen, and then you just keep going and hope nobody notices. I thought it just slightly had that. Never. It wouldn't happen on this podcast. That happens to other podcasters. But it is a bit odd to talk about that when, in fact, we will hear from the government that this is a positive sign of going in the right direction. Of course, it's the opposition. They're not going to welcome it. But I do wonder whether Mel Stride will echo that or whether he will try to make a more testing point. I don't know what you reckon to that, Sam.
Well, I do think that the Tories earlier this year, when sort of the cost of borrowing was going up, and they were sort of making a lot of that, as in fairness were quite a lot of people, but there was a moment in the Commons where it felt like the Tories were over gloom bucketing and talking down the economy, and they sort of lost the argument at one point by overdoing it. It felt like when I was watching the Commons chamber. So I think there is a danger. However, just as a counterpoint, this government, the Labour government, have said living standards are the metric against which you should judge us at the end of the 5 years. If you remember, at one point it was just flat GDP growth, which they wanted to be faster than every other G7 country. Then at the end of last year, they actually pivoted somewhat to a sort of GDP per head measure and an individual living standards measure, and that's the thing that's now contracting. So I think Labour can have the Tories are on pretty solid ground when looking at the per head figure, if they're just using the kind of things that the government says we should look at. But I think what we're really dealing with is very, very, very fine margins. Politicians fighting over a comb, frankly, because while politically the minus sign is all important, whether it's there or whether it's not, economically it's not really. Anyway. Everybody wanted to hear my analysis. Everybody wanted to hear your analysis. But the person that I suspect whose analysis will be treasured even more than both of us will come from Sky economics editor Ed Conway, who we do actually all turn to at moments like this. And in the last few seconds, he has sent me a 1 minute, 10-second voice note, which we're going to play now.
So I've literally just come off set, but I like and respect you so much that this is the first next thing I'm doing. Yeah, I mean, it's good news. It's good news. There's all sorts of provisos we can throw at it. And you can say, oh, yeah, okay, GDP per head is falling. You can say 0.1% growth is basically the same as zero. But, it's not really. It's better than expected in December. Admittedly, the services sector, consumer spending, not that great, but actually production, manufacturing, which has done a bit better than expected. And it's in positive territory. And the number for the previous quarter wasn't revised down, which some people had thought. So far from being a technical recession, which is what obviously Rishi Sunak faced before the election, it is not that. It's a bit of growth. And I think for all the provisos, it's the kind of number that I imagine the Treasury and Downing Street will want to celebrate. And like I say, easy to say there are provisos here, but fundamentally the number is better than pretty much any economist had expected.
That was Sky's Ed Conway. Now, the question is, what does the government do next? There'll be a short pool interview, the sort of easy type of interview with Rachel Reeves popping up from 7:30. So you'll probably see that if you switch on your TV screens while listening to this podcast. She isn't going to do that kind of round of proper, intensive, in-depth interviews, which chancellors normally do on days like this. That seems to have been pulled unofficially. I suspect it's because there was a real fear in the Treasury that this might all end up with big minuses and being a terrible moment. The official explanation, I think, is that Keir Starmer is out and about today talking about growth, and they wouldn't want to trample on his toes. But given that we're not in recession, I think her non-appearance is less of a big deal. I think the government's gearing up to make two arguments today. The first is that they will try and make a momentum argument. So the fact that December is better than the overall quarter suggests that we're on the up, and they'll also point to an EY survey, Ernst & Young survey, that was out yesterday, suggesting that business confidence amongst UK CEOs is growing. To be fair to the Treasury, a couple of kind of not bad numbers out of that. Over half of UK CEOs, 52%, say that the UK is their top destination for capital investment. Their top destinations, that's not bad. And 82% of UK CEOs felt very or somewhat optimistic about the business landscape over the next 12 months. That's 82%, up from 67% in September. So that actually, and that is a reputable survey that gets written up when it's published every quarter in all the newspapers, does point to something.
I think there's something there about business confidence that you put your finger on, Sam, which is there's always a bit of a lagging indicator, as we say in the trade, economics about these things, because there's also that sense just after Christmas that everything was really low and confidence was low, and the government had made a lot of unforced errors, depending on your view, on the employment taxes, etc., and on the non-doms. And the non-doms they've since tried to correct somewhat. But also, I do keep meeting people who are coming in, and particularly who are seeing Britain as a good centre for life sciences, for AI, for that kind of investment. So I was also wondering at some point, is that going to feed through into a slightly more confident mood, or was I just kidding myself because I wanted some good news in the dreary early part of the year? But as you say, that would appear to be the case, and I guess that Rachel Reeves will use this ever so slight uptick, this little smidge of growth to see, this is happening. It is going the right direction, people. It's not as fast as we would all like. Something like that. You could see a new message coming out if we're right and we're not being too optimistic and we don't slide back.
However, you're the Chancellor. One set of good data doesn't completely get you out of the woods. There's more data coming fairly soon. Yesterday, we talked about a different set of data, which is the internal government watchdog, the Office for Budget Responsibility, likely to say that she's effectively going to have to break her rules and rely on borrowing under her current path because she had spent too much, her fiscal rules are too tough. She's probably going to have to end up squeezing public spending in the years to come. The Treasury got a tiz about that story yesterday and announced that the Bloomberg journalists were going to face an official leak inquiry if it turned out that was a proper leak. The James Bowler, the permanent secretary, said that before a select committee. But the question now that they're asking themselves inside the Treasury, so if that was the potentially leaked data from one wave of private internal OBR forecasts. There are 4 more rounds of such forecasts to go before the Chancellor has to make them public on March the 23rd. And actually, they're telling each other inside the Treasury that the next round, which comes on February the 19th in 6 days' time, is much more important and could actually also be revised, and they'll hope it's revised up, because there is all sorts of new data being included in that forecast, population data, the latest tax receipts, and stuff on gilts. So the Treasury are going to be hoping that this today's positive vibes are matched with the next round of internal data they get in 6 days' time.
Right, so given all of that, what are we going to hear from the government today?
You heard Rachel Reeves talk about taking on the NIMBYs and blockers. Keir Starmer's going to be the face of that. He's going to be out and about. I think actually later today he's in Teesside, where I was yesterday, basically talking about building new homes, setting out plans for dozens of new towns with designs inspired by the King. And 100 areas across England have applied to be new towns. And this is all part of the 1.5 million new homes drive in this Parliament, which is a central pledge of the government. I have to say, you can hear lots of optimism and boosterism from the Prime Minister. It's worth just referencing back 2 days ago, because there's always data. There was a big survey of house builders by Knight Frank that suggests that the UK will only manage to build half of the 300,000 homes it's targeting this year because of loads of bottlenecks. So good news, sort of boosterism and positive vibes from the Prime Minister, but the numbers still suggest that this government is off course to miss its 1.5 and will miss its 1.5 million homes target. Now, we've got to move on because there's massive stuff going on. There was an hour and a quarter call between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin yesterday, which seems to have blindsided a lot of the West. Talk now of peace talks already beginning. Is Ukraine being coerced into a position it doesn't want? And can you explain what's going on in this sudden sort of handbrake turn in global politics?
Well, indeed, and it's not good news for Ukraine, and it's very challenging for the allies of Ukraine, including the UK, because what has happened really is that Donald Trump has made good, to put it as he would see it, on his promise to get on with ending the war in Ukraine by going directly to Vladimir Putin. He's held a long call with him by the standards of leader calls about these things, over an hour. And he has said that he wants to start negotiations immediately. Now, what is missing from that, of course, is any input from Ukraine, the country invaded by its powerful neighbour. So the impression, and I hear this very much from my Politico colleague in Kiev, is that Ukraine has really been squeezed out, is being done to, Sam, rather than doing. And of course, that's exactly what they did not want going into negotiations. So what we've heard so far is that Donald Trump has been using talking points which clearly are somewhat soft on Moscow, I would say, as a former Moscow correspondent. They're not propaganda for Putin, but they are more friendly to what Vladimir Putin would want to hear going into talks about Ukraine. He says, for instance, well, Ukraine needs to hold elections, or nobody doubts that Ukraine needs to hold elections, Sam, but once you try to hold them while you are at war, you have questions about where elections can be held, about where there would be Russian interference, about the occupied territories, etc. So that felt a bit like throwing up something as if to suggest that Zelensky was not legitimate in power. Zelensky himself knows he needs to hold elections, but that is not the problem. The problem is Russia being in Ukraine militarily. The second element of that is NATO, and we heard from the new US Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, that NATO membership for Kyiv was off the table and pushing the responsibility for guaranteeing Ukraine's security after the war onto Europeans and others, saying it was time that Europe stepped up. Again, a legitimate point, but if Ukraine cannot have the prospect of getting into or towards NATO membership, then how is its security to be respected, to be protected? And that's been another thing that Moscow has really wanted. It's wanted from the beginning of this conflict to ensure that Ukraine doesn't get close to NATO membership. So there are two things as we look to the Munich Security Conference, where I think we'll hear more from the American side, where it looks as if this process has started, but not on any terms that look very friendly to Ukraine.
I do wonder, Anne, whether actual full NATO membership for Ukraine, with all of the protections that would bring, was ever really a possibility of an outcome for President Zelensky. It is a subject that, to be honest, I've always felt that NATO members have never been quite straight shooting about. So the question is whether the US is just articulating in public very, very firmly, in the case of the new US Defense Secretary, something that was always the case, or whether actually the position has moved. There are no easy answers here, but it does look like a worrying time. Couple of bits of UK reaction just to round up. The UK Defence Secretary John Healey, happy birthday John, yesterday to my colleague Deborah Haynes at Sky News, gave the clearest possible indication that the UK does not agree with this approach. They said it's for Ukrainians to decide when to start talking and on what terms. I mean, that is a rebuke, but it's a very diplomatically put rebuke, and we don't seem to want to shout at the new US administration, however cross we are in private. And also worth pointing out, we seem to have a fascinating mini U-turn from Nigel Farage yesterday. This took place at the press conference where he said, now, of course, you remember in the election, he said that he'd always thought that the eastward encroachment of European NATO was a mistake, and he got into a lot of trouble for that. But now you have Nigel Farage, and not his first break with Trump's White House, saying that he thinks it's essential that Ukraine joins NATO.
One point on that, you might well be right that it's unrealistic or not foreseeable for Ukraine to join NATO. But remember, this is about negotiation. And I think that's quite interesting that Nigel Farage has done his 180 on that, because it's not about whether it happens or when and if it happens. Is it on the table as something Ukraine can ask for in a negotiation? And I think that is why John Healey is being so strong on that point. It's really to avoid that sense that Ukraine is being completely superseded. You usually don't take something off a table in a negotiation before you even sit down for the meaty part. So I think there's going to be quite a lot of friction inside the NATO alliance and with the US on that specific point.
Well, that is all we've got time for. That my house is sort of rejecting us going on any longer. The washing machine's going off in the background. The kids are making their breakfast. And we finally had a response from Mel Stride about GDP numbers, but we've run out of time for that. We will be back on Monday morning. Now, next week is recess. Anne will just be back from the Munich Security Conference. I will be broadcasting to you from a sauna, although I promise I will have my clothes on. It's the only place I can hide from my kids. So we will be back with a look at the whole week ahead on Monday morning, and then we'll be off for the rest of the week. So we will see you then.
Hot stuff.
Donald Trump is heading back to the White House.
Together we can truly make America great again.
We are in for an unpredictable but fascinating 4 years.
And we're going to be following every twist and turn for the first 100 days. We'll be bringing you the latest updates and analysis first thing every morning. So join me, James Matthews.
Me, Martha Kelnick.
And me, Mark Stone.
For Trump 100 every weekday at 6 a.m, wherever you get your podcasts.